All right, get ready for a deep dive, and this one is, well, this one's a doozy. We're taking a look at Abercrombie and Fitch today. You know, that all-American preppy brand. Yeah, well, there's been some shocking accusations, and it really flips that clean image on its head. What we've got is a recently unsealed indictment. It's really something. It reads like a crime thriller.
It does, yeah. It's really intense. So the indictment is focused on Michael Jeffries. He was the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch from 1992 to 2014.
Yeah.
And, during that time, he gained a lot of wealth and power, and these charges allege that he used all that to run a secret operation like a sex trafficking and prostitution operation.
Wow. So we're talking international travel, elaborate schemes, a whole staff. It's crazy. And we're going to get into all of it.
Yeah, for sure. This indictment really paints a disturbing picture, alleging that Jeffries, along with his partner Matthew Smith, and this recruiter named James Jacobson, they exploited tons of men for sex over a period of the indictment says roughly 2008 to 2015.
So this was going on for years. Wow. What exactly are the charges that they're facing?
Well, there's some serious charges, including sex trafficking, interstate prostitution, and the use of force, fraud, and coercion. And to be clear, when we talk about interstate prostitution, it means that this operation had crossed state lines. So it suggests that there was a larger network, more organized, and the coercion element. That implies that these men were pressured, like forced to participate through threats and manipulation. It really highlights this power imbalance.
Okay, so let's unpack how all of this allegedly worked. The indictment mentions these elaborate sex events. What were those?
So picture this. We're talking luxurious destinations around the world. Places like England, France, Italy, even exotic places like Morocco and St. Bartholomew. These weren't just, casual gatherings. Jeffries and Smith planned these meticulously, according to the indictment. Jacobson's role, he was the one who recruited the men, often through these tryouts that involved sexual acts. Can you imagine that pressure and manipulation?
That's just awful. And did they have a whole staff to manage these events?
Yeah, that's what the indictment says. They had a whole staff dedicated to it. They took care of all the logistics, travel arrangements, security, even providing drugs and alcohol. That level of organization, all those resources, it points to them deliberately trying to keep the operation hidden, trying to keep it all running smoothly.
It's disturbing how much effort they allegedly put into hiding all this. But how did they convince these men to participate in the first place?
Well, this is where it gets really disturbing. The indictment alleges that Jeffries, Smith, and Jacobson, they use a combination of coercion and deception. They allegedly withheld information about what these events really were. And they kind of dangled the allure of modeling opportunities with Abercrombie and Fitch, to lure the men in.
So they were taking advantage of the men's aspirations, their dreams of working with this big brand. That's incredibly manipulative.
It is. They played on these men's ambitions and made it seem like these opportunities, like they couldn't refuse. On top of that, the indictment says that they required these men to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and even took away their personal belongings, all to ensure their silence and maintain control.
It seems like there's a pattern here of isolating and controlling these men, making them more vulnerable to exploitation.
That's definitely a key point here. And it gets even darker from here.
I have a feeling you're going to tell me something pretty disturbing.
Yeah. The indictment alleges that they engaged in, they call it physical grooming without consent.
What does that even mean in this context?
Well, physical grooming in this case, it refers to shaving the victim's genitals without their consent. So it just adds another layer of humiliation and violation to all of this. And on top of that, the indictment describes how they pressured these men to consume alcohol and drugs, which further erodes their ability to consent, adds to their vulnerability.
It's just horrifying to think about what these men went through.
It is. It
Yeah.
raises a big question. How could this exploitation happen within a company like Abercrombie and Fitch, a company known for its image, its branding? We'll dig deeper into that as we continue our deep dive. Yeah, it really is a stark contrast. You've got this dark underbelly hidden beneath a brand all about youth and beauty and this, American ideal.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what else might be going on behind those perfect images in their ads.
Right, exactly. Makes you think about us as consumers,
Yeah.
and our responsibility to really look beyond that and ask the tough questions about the companies we support. But going back to this indictment, one of the most disturbing things is this targeting of heterosexual men.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It seemed really calculated. Why do you think they might have specifically gone after that group?
Well, it raises some really disturbing possibilities. Were they preying on these men because they thought
Mm-hmm.
they'd be less likely to come forward, out of fear of judgment
Mm-hmm.
or not being believed? Were they taking advantage of the stigma around male victims? It's a
Mm-hmm.
chilling thought.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity
Yeah.
to an already awful situation. Were there any other allegations that really stuck out to you?
Two, yeah. They really highlight this level of abuse and control that was going on. First, the indictment claims that Jeffries and Smith would sometimes inject these men with substances
Mm-hmm.
to induce erections. And they did this without any medical reason for it.
Wait, without medical need? That's just, I don't even know what to say.
That's awful. The indictment says they did this to force the men to participate, to satisfy their own desires,
Oh.
totally disregarding the potential trauma, the physical and emotional trauma they were inflicting on these victims.
Yeah, it's like a complete violation, taking away any possibility of consent. What was the second allegation that stood out to you?
Well, the indictment also talks about instances of non-consensual sexual acts. It describes how Jeffries and Smith allegedly engaged in or forced these men to engage in acts that they didn't consent to or couldn't consent to. This included accounts of forced anal penetration and using high-pressured enema.
God, these details are so hard to hear. But it's important to acknowledge what these men went through.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that even though the indictment uses John Does to protect the identities of the victims, these are real people whose lives have been deeply affected by all of this. The emotional distress, the long-term psychological effects, the difficulty they'll have seeking justice, it's just a huge burden to carry.
Yeah. When you read this indictment, it's easy to get caught up in the shock and anger. But I think it's also important to ask, how could this even happen? What would make Jeffries and his associates do this?
Oh, it's a big question. It gets into the psychology of power, entitlement, and maybe a really messed up sense of reality. Did they think they were above the law because of their money and their status? Did they convince themselves that they could, treat other people as objects? It's complicated. There's not an easy answer.
And how do they manage to keep this a secret for so long? We're talking international travel, a whole staff dedicated to this.
Well, that makes you think about whether other people were involved. Did anyone else at Abercrombie & Fitch know this was happening? Were there signs that people just ignored or dismissed? Was there like a culture of silence at the company that let this continue?
It seems like this case brings up more questions than answers, but it's clear that this goes way beyond just a few individuals.
I agree. It forces us to look at these bigger systems, these structures that allow this kind of abuse of power. It makes us question the role of corporate culture, the responsibilities of leaders, and what safeguards should be in place to protect people.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about the culture there. At Abercrombie & Fitch, I mean. Under Jeffries, was there something about the environment or the company's values, even their image, that could have contributed to this?
It's definitely something to think about. Abercrombie & Fitch, especially when Jeffries was in charge, they were known for that and that really sexualized marketing. And they cultivated this very specific image. You could even say it was exclusionary. So whether that played a part in creating an environment where this could happen, well, that's something investigators will probably be looking into.
This whole case is just, I don't know, just makes me feel uneasy. It really shows how power, especially when there's no one checking it, it can corrupt. And it really emphasizes how important it is to have systems in place to protect people who are vulnerable to this kind of exploitation.
What's really disturbing is this is an industry that's all about image and perception. The fashion world, it often presents this glamorous facade. But this indictment, it peels back the layers and it reveals this potential dark side. And we can't ignore it.
It's definitely a wake-up call. It's like we need to look beyond the surface, question the stories we're told, and
Yeah.
hold people and institutions accountable for what they do.
And this goes way beyond just the fashion industry. This case, it speaks to a much broader issue. How do we address and prevent these abuses of power, not just in companies, but in every part of our lives?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and something we should all be considering. What can we do as individuals to help create a culture where these kinds of abuses are exposed and ultimately stopped from happening?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, understanding how power works, the ways people can manipulate others, and being aware of situations where someone's rights are being violated and speaking up.
Right, and it's also about creating a culture of accountability where people in positions of power are held responsible for their actions. and where victims feel safe to come forward without being afraid of retaliation or being judged.
I think that's a really important point. This deep dive into the Abercrombie and Fitch scandal, it's brought some really dark things to light,
Mm.
but it also gives us a chance to talk about power, ethics, and our responsibility to create a safer and more just world for everyone.
Well said. And that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.